This is a White Mountain story. It's a story about legacy, resilience, and a courageous decision. It's the story of what happened to Tunnel Brook Road. For decades, Tunnel Brook Road had been a gravel forest service road, running alongside its namesake, a typical White Mountain stream, in the White Mountain National Forest, in the town of Benton, New Hampshire. The U.S. Forest Service manages the White Mountain National Forest for multiple uses, and Tunnel Brook Road fit right in. The road brought permitted logging contractors to timber sites, hunters deeper into the forest, gold panners to the river's edge, hikers to the head of the Benton Trail on Mount Moosilauke, and snowmobilers, walkers, and nature lovers closer to the places they love. Tunnel Brook Road had been many things to many people, and then, one day, in late August 2011, it was gone.
Tropical Storm Irene passed through New Hampshire in late August of 2011. In this portion of the forest, it dropped around 4 to maybe 5 inches of rain, and all the rivers and streams came up very high.
Oh my God, look it down there.
The storm came in with great power, inflicting an estimated $10 million in damage on the White Mountain National Forest. What it left of Tunnel Brook Road was almost unrecognizable.
This is much different than just a couple months ago.
Where there used to be a road, we saw a river, or what was then a dry channel, and what now is looking more like a river.
As a hydrologist with the White Mountain National Forest, Sheila Johnson was accustomed to change. But what she saw at Tunnel Brook Road was not to normal geologic scale.
There were areas that were damaged that I definitely didn't expect, because we had some dynamic situations with where trees fell in, or where log jams occurred in the river and pushed it in one direction, or where small tributaries overflowed through undersized culverts and created a huge amount of damage for what's normally a tiny trickle flowing into Tunnel Brook.
We had some landslides. It was a rather dramatic one up here on the side of Mount Moosilauke. Dumped a lot of trees and soil deeper into the watershed. As the stream came up, it obviously got a lot more energy. That caused more debris to fall into the river, and that debris, as it jammed, caused the Tunnel Brook to leave its banks and to expand out into the floodplain, to erode parts of the road.
We had a large woody debris jam just downstream of where we're standing that actually blocked off a portion of the main channel of the river. You can see behind me, there's also a large gravel bar. There was a huge amount of deposition above the debris jam that built that bar. So we have 2 channels on either side of the gravel bar. One of them, as you can see now, is flowing very close to the road and at a higher elevation of the road. So since this spring, it has actually broken through the road shoulder, and a large portion of Tunnel Brook is now flowing down Tunnel Brook Road.
Pulling yourself up by the bootstraps. It's been an ethos in these parts since the pioneers first made inroads into the White Mountain wilderness. Local history is filled with stories of adversity overcome, hotels burned and rebuilt, entire mountain notches choked by landslide and cleared. There was a standard to live up to, a standard of resilience.
Our first instinct with all of our infrastructure that gets damaged, whether it's by a hurricane or not, is to how do we put it back the way it was. People are used to that. Those roads are there for a purpose. And so our first instinct is to try to put it back the way it was.
To restore this road, though, there would be obstacles.
Of course, how much is it going to cost? The concern right away is, do we have the money? In the case of Tunnel Brook, because of the kind of road it was eligible for immediate repair funds from the Federal Highway Administration under their ERFO program, Emergency Relief for Federally Owned Roads. And we put in a request with the Federal Highway Administration to repair Tunnel Brook Road.
Then there was the how. The river had changed, moved. Could it be put back?
It was just hard to imagine how we would get back in here and establish some of the uses that we had in this watershed before.
It could be conceived to be easier to dredge the river out to a lower elevation so that the water flows lower than the road. and it's easier just to pull the material out near the road. But the problem with that is the river's always changing and more sediment takes the place of that material you dredged out. We would probably just end up destabilizing these slump banks even more, and you would get more trees and more boulders and cobbles and gravels filling in the river down below, causing the same problems we just experienced.
Just as the river had changed course, so now was the question evolving from how long will it take to fix Tunnel Brook to can Tunnel Brook Road ever really be fixed? Irene was bringing new attention to a seemingly fatal flaw built right into the road in the early 1900s.
We know that roads were put in along rivers because it was easier, cheaper, and a good example in this watershed, many of the tributaries flowing into Tunnel Brook are very steep until they get right down to the mouth of the river. And to put a bridge on those tributaries on the steep slope is very expensive because they're big, wide gorges on the steep mountains. So it made sense why they built the road down here, because the water spread out in the flatter ground and they could put in a smaller culvert. So it was much cheaper to build the road down here, much flatter to build a road, a better location for a road in the short term. What has changed since they built the road 100 years ago, maybe the first time, is the river elevation has grown with each flood by bringing in all the boulders and cobbles and sediments as these mountains erode. So now your riverbed is growing in elevation, but your roadbed is still at the same elevation it was originally built at. Sections of this road would have to be built very, very, very high if we were going to keep the road here, but then you would have to worry about erosion at the base of that road. And that would involve dredging the river and building the road up. And you have to ask yourself, for a forest road with recreational use and entries for logging maybe every 15 to 20 years, is it worth that kind of maintenance to come in and dredge and riprap and build your road up every time it floods out?
More and more, restoring the road to its previous state seemed like delaying the inevitable. More erosion, more repair, more cost, and more damage to the environment, including increased sediment in Tunnel Brook affecting downstream public drinking water.
We started to realize that Tunnel Brook was a lot more complicated than our initial instincts to just repair it were. And we wondered, given climate change, the prediction for more extreme events, whether that actually made good sense to just put the road back where it was.
You know, I think the Forest Service is more about managing for the long term, looking at the big picture. And we saw an opportunity here to build something that was more sustainable.
It's our responsibility right now to make the best decisions that we can with what we know. And what we know about Tunnel Brook Road right now is something different than managers knew 10, 20, 30 years ago. We know more about climate change. We have a better understanding of how floodplains work, and we're taking all of that knowledge to make the best decision that we can right now.
The Forest Service made a decision. Irene was a turning point. The response would be new. Tunnel Brook Road would be decommissioned. The goal was not to fix nature, but to fix what man had done to it. They would attempt to set the floodplain up for a gradual return to the way it was before the road was first built a century ago. It was courageous. It was controversial. Was it right? The scale and complexity of restoring the Tunnel Brook floodplain were at a level never before faced by the Forest Service, and funding was limited. Per standard policy, the Forest Service solicited public feedback on the decision. They also brought in partners to provide broad strategic input, diverse professional expertise, and additional financial resources. This would make the project more efficient, impactful, and reflective of the forest's multi-use mission. One of the main goals of the project was to bring back the natural health of the Tunnel Brook aquatic system. And in New Hampshire, there's no greater expert on the way mountain rivers should be than the wild eastern brook trout.
Brook trout is our native species here in New Hampshire, our cold water species. Prior to sort of the heavy logging, fish could travel anywhere. There were no barriers. They could move up and down tributaries to spawn. Once we started logging, we opened the streams up and they warmed up. So as far as brook trout goes, often the temperatures would get warmer than they could tolerate. So they would not move around the main stem, they would hunker down in tributaries. Once we started crossing the tributaries with roads and putting in culverts that were often undersized, just the stream channels would end up overtopping the culverts, and on the bottom side, the downstream side of the culvert, they would create perched conditions. So at that point, fish couldn't move back up into the tributaries, so they were stuck in the main stem, which often meant that it was temperatures too warm for them to survive. So if we want to grow the base of our fisheries, which is wild fish, we really need to reconnect the system so wild brook trout can survive.
Removal of culverts was one step in allowing the Tunnel Brook floodplain to reclaim its natural function. But there was another.
Historically, there was a lot of woody debris, large trees that would fall into the rivers and provide some structure and provide some diversity of habitats and help the river establish a more meandering, dynamic form.
So that ideal aquatic habitat for trout is this mixture of riffles and pools, and that you have some wood in the stream that provides shade, and it's this complexity in a stream that makes for the best aquatic habitat. When it's just a cleaned out channel and it's nothing but rock and riffles, there isn't really a place for fish to rest, to eat. They're constantly fighting the current.
Wood also helps slow down rivers and acts as a filter in floods, keeping outside sediment from filling in the riverbed and changing its course. Clear-cut logging in the early 1900s removed wood from the rivers and eliminated mature forest from riverbanks. Without wood to fall into the water, White Mountain streams became quicker, straighter, shallower, and more prone to erosion. The forest we have in the White Mountains today is young. As it ages, it will naturally contribute wood back into the area's rivers and streams, and these waterways may begin to resemble their previous form. But seeding rivers manually with large wood would hasten the process.
I believe that that's the key in this, is to increase access to the floodplains, slow the water down, and using large wood and natural methods to do that works really well, as opposed to hardening stream banks. The goal is to let the stream get back to a point where it's functioning the way that it wants to restore itself.
In some areas, Tropical Storm Irene took care of this seeding herself.
Storms such as Irene, they caused a lot of devastation to infrastructure, but by eroding out those steep slopes, they brought a lot of wood into these rivers. That wood will create habitat for the native brook trout. And when that storm came across the entire White Mountain National Forest, it was creating these new habitat features at very large landscape scales, something we could never do with our small habitat scale efforts in the past.
This is a good example of where we're letting nature take its course. You can see behind me the slumping bank that we're basically going to leave that. Over time, the edge will erode, the trees will fall down. A little bit downstream, we have some trees that are about to fall into the brook. And ultimately, the bank will reach a stable slope over time. We can let the brook return to the condition that it was before a lot of heavy logging happened in the 1800s.
The Forest Service worked with its partners to determine where human intervention was needed and what kind. After a bidding process, they hired an engineer to design a plan for the site and a contractor to execute it. This included putting wood into the stream, securing some banks with riprap, removing culverts, recontouring parts of the eroded road, ripping the road to reveal the organic material beneath the fill and gravel, and then starting at the top of the road and working back out, covering the road with natural materials. Work on the road began in the fall of 2014, took a break in winter, and resumed in spring finishing in the fall of 2015. After several years of hard work on the project, the results were looking good.
We're walking up right now on the pretty dramatic final installation here on the Tunnel Brook stream restoration. This is where the river, in the very last instance, jumped its banks and created quite a bit of destruction and blew a couple culverts out down below us before it got back in its channel. And this is the area of greatest weakness. This is actually the site where the river had blown out of its banks several previous times before Hurricane Irene. And so all this debris that you see piled up here is material that we've had the contractor put in here to kind of armor this bank, but also in a very natural way, where before we might have used riprap, here we're using this wood. It will allow water to pass, but it will also slow the water down and cause it to drop more sediment. This is the former road bed of Tunnel Brook Road, and you can see in the far where it's been grassed in, we've revegetated the entire stretch of the road that's been decommissioned. But we've also put periodically down the road these piles of brush. Again, you know, in the floodplain, which is what we're in right now, we expect over time that Tunnel Brook will escape the banks and get out into the floodplain. And this wood here will slow the water down, cause it to deposit its sediment, rather than dig in and erode the old roadbed. So right up here you see one of the effects of a dynamic natural system is we have some erosion already taking place from some of the recent rainstorms. And this is not unexpected. There's no way that we can prevent this type of erosion. But what we've left in here in some of our design features is designed to address exactly that. So we still have some of these baffles in here to slow the water down. This is all biodegradable. We've got some brush sitting in here. And then we have this little side channel, and you can see where the sediment from the erosion up here has accumulated in this side channel. The idea is to slow the water down, let the sediment drop out before the water actually gets into the stream itself. This was the first blowout on the Tunnel Brook Road from Irene. And the road ran straight through here, and the stream, with a lot of energy coming down off the side of Mount Moosilauke, had just carved out the embankment and moved on down. We lost about half the road width here. And so this is a definite weak point. The stream is aimed right at this area as it comes off that upper curve, and that's a point of high energy. We've roughed this whole swale out, reduced the slope that had been left from the washout, the original washout, brought the edge back. And then by putting in these rocks and logs and brush, we recognize this area is going to continue to erode, but what we wanted to do is to do it slowly and not just continue to have a blowout, or to get back into the main road channel and erode all this additional sediment. So it's just a case of asking the stream to slow down a little bit. And it very much duplicates what a natural process might be, where logs and trees have fallen into a stream as it undercuts a bank. We just did that here with the contractor, placing those logs and stumps, kind of speeding up what would be a natural process.
The decommissioning of Tunnel Brook Road will have far-reaching impact. Most directly, it will impact access to the area. Tunnel Brook Road is now Tunnel Brook Trail. Hikers will now have an additional half-hour walk to the Benton Trailhead on Mount Moosilauke, and those who hike Tunnel Brook Trail regularly will be witness to a dramatic evolution.
Over the years, the road itself will brush in, the trail corridor will become narrower and narrower, until in time, it will just be a trail corridor, maybe 3 feet wide, with a path through the woods kind of effect.
Perhaps the even bigger impact will be the project's effect on the future of infrastructure management in the White Mountain National Forest.
Will this be the example that we'll use every time a road washes out, every time we have a large precipitation event? I don't think so. But it will be a test case, and it'll be something we'll be able to go back to and refer to and learn lessons from as we go into the future.
If we are continually investing into maintenance or repair of infrastructure, we may need to rethink where those trails or roads should occur on the landscape. In some cases, we may rebuild where it is because it's worth the risk. There's enough demand and need for that infrastructure. In other cases, we may decide it's better to move that infrastructure now, maybe at a higher price, to sustain it and make it a resilient piece of infrastructure for the future.
The key is the collaboration and the partnership, bringing expertise from a group of people as opposed to individuals, and coming up with a solution that works for both the resource, Trout Unlimited, and the public as well.
Much of the project's impact on management philosophy may depend on how the floodplain responds to the restoration work. This answer will come with time and observation.
Things that we'd look for in the future is what is happening in the channel of the stream. Is the channel moving much, or is it very stable where it is? How is that channel moving in relationship to the types of precipitation events that we've had? Secondly, we would look to see at the structures that we have put into the floodplain to slow the stream down or to keep the stream in its channel at a couple of key points. Are they functioning the way we would want to see them? And then the third thing we would look at is design features that we put in to those side channels. Are those functioning the way that we'd want to see them?
The story of Tunnel Brook doesn't end here. This is an exciting new beginning. And since the White Mountain National Forest is the people's forest, perhaps it's time for you to experience this story up close and personal.
To go out and see a stream year after year after year and really think about how it's changing in its banks has been very exciting from an intellectual point of view, and has really helped connect me personally with some of the change that we see in natural systems that otherwise you might not bother to check in with. So I'd encourage people to come out, look at this as a natural laboratory, and tune in to Tunnel Brook.